Thank you so much. And what a great way to kick off today's discussion. We love having you here for the WeGive Summit. We're super grateful to start with your beautiful music. Thank you. Welcome everyone to Moving Billions for Justice, a conversation of the future of racial equity-centered grantmaking. My name is Sara Lomelin. I'm the Executive Director of Philanthropy Together. And following this session, we invite you to stay and join us for speed networking. So we will give you more details at the end. I am very, very, very fired up to start this conversation with this incredible group of change makers. I feel confident knowing that these four amazing leaders are at the forefront of investing in racial equity. And I don't want to take any minutes of the conversation. So let's get started. As we stated in the description of this session, you know, what hurts us, what hurts one of us affects us all. Systems of racism inform our daily lives, no matter who we are and what bodies we live in. So I want to start this conversation, you know, by asking each one of you, how has racial equity shape your life and work? I want you to share who you are, who your people are, and where you come from, and how that informs your work. Who wants to start? Ebony?
I'll start, yes. So number one, Sara, thank you for having us tonight. I'm really thrilled. I've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. So excited that it is finally here and we have an amazing audience and hopefully interactive audience that will throw things in the chat and have us respond to at the same time. So appreciate always being here. So Ebony Thomas, I lead a racial equity and economic opportunity for Bank of America. And within that frame of work, we're focused on delivering $1.25 billion over the next 5 years to people in communities of color in the areas of health, small business, jobs, and home ownership. And so a tall order to be sure, but we have met the moment of obligation, the moment in which spark not new work, but work that needed to be amplified. And so thrilled to be a part again of this esteemed group and share from my perspective. What I think is so important as you think about how did racial equity or equality shape who we are and the work that we're doing, I think it's so important because when you think about leaders of color and how we bring that lived experience to the work, it's so important. And when you bring that experience to the work, you get different results. You have a different perspective. You understand the impact to communities because you are a part of that community. And then when you collaborate across a number of different platforms and individuals, I think ultimately we get a better result. So the same way in which we talk about corporate America, when boards are more diverse and when organizations are more diverse, the profit margins are better. The same applies in philanthropy. When those who are focused and delivering and doing the work is diverse, we get different results and we start to see really meaningful impact. So for me, in a lot of ways, I'm a first gen college student. I'm the youngest of 6 blue collar worker, parents who did not go to college. I have grandparents who worked really hard, but, didn't complete, all of their education. I went to a historically Black college. And so a lot of that is rooted in how I see the world and being able to do the work on behalf of the bank. So that experience of all those things collective and then leaving an historically Black college and going into public education really shaped how I deliver and think about this work across the Bank of America platform. So those experiences lend very nicely into how we fund, how we partner, how we create collaborative opportunities across many of the organizations in which we support. So excited and thrilled to be here and really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Ebony. CeCe, you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you, Sara. Again, thank you to Sara and the whole Philanthropy Together team for inviting me to be part of this important conversation today with these other amazing speakers as well. As Sara said, my name is Ciciley Moore, and I am the daughter of Willie James Jones and Sylvia Rodriguez Amaya. I, growing up, was immersed in a culture of community care in the small agricultural town of Salinas, California, most well known for the lettuce fields and historic farm worker labor movements. Because of generations of family and the example that my parents stowed in me, they strengthened me and they nurtured me in their own strength and their own resilience to, that was built through their own joy as well as their own trials, that came from racism and low wage labor for most of their lives. And, those values, family and community first, I have always understood that success was measured in relationships and invaluable to our collective well-being. And so coming in now, I'm a program officer at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, where I have the opportunity to work with many organizations across the globe in supporting, racial equity and building capacity to lead for racial equity. And I bring, all of those values from my community and from my family into the work that I do every day. So I'm looking forward to, diving into this conversation, and thanks again for having me.
Thank you, CeCe. Rita, do you want to go next?
Sure, I'd love to. I also am so delighted to be here and be a part of this conversation. I think the joy I have around it comes because I'm able to show up with two hats on. Obviously, I have my organizational hat with leading as the president of Borealis Philanthropy. And I also have my giving circle hat. And so I appreciate this gathering and all of the audience members who are representing for their own giving circles, because I would not fully understand the power of collective giving if it weren't for being a member of the Black Benefactors Giving Circle in DC for almost the last decade. And so that is really how I've learned so much about the power of pooling our funds for greater impact, for building community, for learning. How I come to this work, I come to it as a Black queer woman from the South. I'm a daughter of red dirt and clay who is made home in the big city. Well, maybe not that big, depending on, if you're talking the specific geography of DC. But I live in DC by way of Huntsville, Alabama, and Houston, Texas, and St. Louis, Missouri, and a bit of Boston. I'm the youngest daughter of Floretta and Albert Morris. Albert's a florist, a small business owner, HBCU grad, and the first philanthropist that I knew. Though at the time, I wouldn't have called it philanthropy or even known to name it that. I just thought it was how you live, how you show up, and how you're in community with your family and others and your people. And so now I am a professional in the sector in philanthropy, but I don't think that that's what makes me a philanthropist. I think that makes me a grant maker, right? What makes me a philanthropist is what I do with my personal resources. And so that is why I really appreciate this conversation. I'll say that the last thing I'll say about how I come to this is that before I was an organizer in philanthropy, which is what I consider my role at Borealis. As a social justice intermediary, we pool funds from larger institutions to fuel and resource movements for racial and intersectional justice. But before I was organizing within philanthropy to organize institutions, I was a community organizer organizing in the streets with young people. And so that is the approach, that is the grounding that always carries me and holds me accountable to how I show up.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you. And I am loving all this. I think this session should have been like 3.5 hours long. Lem, tell us a little bit about yourself and your story.
Sure, yeah. It's good to be here with all of you, and thank you to Sara and the Philanthropy Together team. Happy to be in this conversation. I come from a family that is very mixed in terms of, so Denise and Bill White are my parents. My mom grew up in an all-white neighborhood in Boston, but her family grew up poor. My dad grew up in South Chicago, and I grew up in Oakland in California, and also Moraga, which is a little town in California next to Oakland. And I also played music in the Black church and spent a lot of time in South Berkeley with peers, and then grew up in this relatively wealthy mostly white town in Moraga. And so this experience of going back and forth between different cultures and having to navigate different systems and really understand often what was happening, the subtleties of racism that I was experiencing, particularly in a mostly liberal white town. And so that translates in huge ways to how I do my work now. So I'm the co-CEO of Possibility Labs, which is a new organization, also a social justice financial intermediary that's moving integrated capital, and also supporting movement organizations as they think about their resourcing needs, particularly as they get more complicated. And so a lot of what we do is navigate the IRS, navigate financial systems, navigate philanthropy, and try to do that in a way that is both moving towards the framework of a just transition and thinking about the world that we want to be in, but also understanding that we have to live in the world that we are in now. And so what does it mean to have a transitional infrastructure that can get us there? And so I bring all of that sort of like history of code switching myself. I think, a lot of us that work in philanthropy have had to do that, whether it's in multiple different kinds of ways in institutions. So yeah, that's how I show up to this work, and happy to be in this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your stories. And, we and somebody saying what a powerhouse panel. Yes, I agree. And I heard, the words of family, community, being in different environments. Being a philanthropist is through your heart, right? It's not what you do professionally. The power of have lived experiences, to guide your work. So let's get started with all the questions. Ebony, what principles do you lean on to guide you in your work? I know you talked about, the importance of your story, and, what are those principles that you lean on?
I mean, there's so many. And, I love, I think even in the comments, and you hear about everyone's story and journey, and they're also incredibly powerful, and powerful in the way in which the work that they lead, the influence they have inside their organizations, within their companies. And so, hopefully this is a question that others would answer too. When I specifically think about the work within Bank of America, and being able to lead the charge on this 1.2 billion, which I take incredibly serious, and it's humbling at times to go back to the term of being, a grant maker, and what are those things and opportunities that's really going to make a significant impact. And so when I'm thinking about, or when we are exploring opportunities, number one, we think about what is the partnership? Not just, that we have a power of a grantee to grant dollars, but what's the relationship and the partner? What's the opportunity for us to really dive in deep into this work? I was on a call today, and we were talking through some work, and I had to pause and say, what works for you guys, right? Like, what, you know, yeah, we have opportunities in which there are issues and things in which we want to lean in very heavily, but we also have to respect the fact that these individuals, these non-for-profits, these organizations have been on the ground doing the work, and they have been doing the work in these communities for a number of years. And let's respect that. Let's respect that this is how they've done it, and they've had meaningful impact, and how can we increase that impact and double down on that work, right? So it's that mutual respect of understanding, let's create some type of partnership here. And so again, I'm probably the newbie to this group, because I've not had an extensive career in philanthropy. And so I approach the work from a totally different lens of how we should be thinking about this. So number one, the principles that I'm leaning on is this collaborative? Am I respecting the work? Am I respecting the individuals who have been doing this? And how do we approach it? How do we reimagine the work in a way that maybe hasn't been done before? And I approach it from my value system as well. I think I heard that earlier from one of the other panelists is, that value system absolutely comes into play. And that value system of understanding what it feels like to be considered, kind of less than, and feeling a lack of belonging in some ways. And so if you remember that feeling, you bring those values and principles to the table when you're having conversations with people, to include them, to help them think through and be a part of the overall conversation. So the values in which I use, as I think about approaching, is like the spirit and how do we collaborate? What are we all trying to achieve? Do we have a common goal? What's that thread? And let's hang ourselves on that common thread that we're trying to achieve in that goal. And then, respect is just, again, is incredibly important, that this work, all of the audience who are philanthropists and are doing the work in their communities, respecting that knowledge and the base in which they're coming from, hear those ideas, and then think about how do we execute on those ideas in a way that will create long-term sustainable change.
Thank you. I love what you said about, respect, because how many times, right? Sometimes funders, donors, we need to take off that savior hat, right? Like community knows what community needs, and the people that are closer to the challenge are the ones that know the solution. And we, as Giving Circle members, as individual donors, as huge corporate and foundation philanthropists as you, we just need to kind of, move away and let the people that knows how to do the work. So I love this. Thank you.
No, and I just, one other thing to that point, and that's true, right? I think sometimes people come into this savior mentality. My mentality is, I'm here to serve. How do I help me serve? Help me serve the community. Help me think through this differently. This is not save your money. These issues have been around for 400 years and will continue to be. And so let's think through what then are the ways in which we can serve our community in a collaborative way. So completely agree.
Thank you. Lem, what does racial equity look like in practice? When it is real, what will our lives, our work, and our world look like?
The first thing that comes to mind with that question is a story that I heard on the radio the other day, thinking about what's happening in housing across the country. So how, the price of housing is going up, and in many places the moratoriums on rent are being lifted and people get evicted. And the people that are going to be most impacted by that, as we all know already, is Black and brown folks. And as I was listening to that and thinking about that, I began to unpack sort of like how do we get there? We hear a lot of stories like that around the impacts of inequity, but how do we get there? What happens when a Black or a brown person walks into a bank? and goes to get a home loan. What's that experience look like? What happens when someone is at work and they feel like they've been harmed and they bring that up? What's the risk that they're taking when they name the racism that they're experiencing? What's the experience when, as Black and brown people, we leave a context and we're holding the trauma of having experienced all the microaggressions, or sometimes the not so microaggressions? And so when I think about what does equity look like, it's to me unpacking all of those little things that happen in our everyday lives, all the little processes that we put in place to keep Black and brown people out, and dismantling them and redesigning them. I think in philanthropy, it's, what does it look like when you're interacting with someone as a philanthropist in a position of power? That it's going to be your decision, and especially for those of us who are people of color in positions of power in philanthropy, it's ultimately going to be our decision, where that money goes and how to navigate our own systems. And so I think thinking through the process at every step of the way, what does it look like when someone reaches out to you? What's a grant application look like? How do we follow up with people? I think when I think about building more equitable systems, it's about unpacking all of those tiny things that lead to the huge inequities, and reimagining them in such a way that as a Black or brown person, the experience that we're having is that experience of community, or it's the experience of being welcome, or it's the experience of having access. It's the experience of anticipating that our needs are going to be generally met in that context. That we're going to leave a situation not feeling like we've been harmed. And so I think when we shift and change all of the processes that cause the harms, that lead to the impacts that we hear so often, and each of those little pieces changes, we begin to have a world in which we can all thrive. And I think that's what equity looks like when it's happening, is that everyone feels like they're thriving. We're in community. We're following the leadership of communities knowing what they need. Particularly as philanthropists, we're looking to communities to tell us, what do you need? And we're listening to that and we're following that. And centering them as designers, or in some ways, in some sense, centering people of color, which is us on this panel, as designers in our own stories and our own futures and our own communities, and resourcing that at scale. So I think that's what equity looks like in practice.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone wants to chime in on that one. I see a lot of nodding. Or we can move to the next one.
No, I mean, it's in some ways it's like the liminality of Blackness, right? You're like in this threshold space of like, where am I? Where do I fit in? Where does this I'm here in this space here. And to Lim's point, equity in practice not only is a feeling, but it's also an action, right? It is demonstrated in structural ways, in systemic ways, and it's interesting. Which we could think about, how do you measure that, right? What does that truly look like? Because we talk about it in practice, but what's the true measurement of that equity, which continues to be a major topic of conversation?
Yeah, and the only thing I would add, Sara, is part of doing racial equity work is recognizing also when we are part of the harm, right? Even when we're trying to do good, Lem mentioned, recognizing that harm, and then being able to hold each other in commitment to repair and stopping the harm. And so that's a crucial part of moving forward and progressing towards racial equity, especially coming from institutionalized philanthropy. So yeah, I would add that.
Thank you, CeCe. Greta, this is for you. So as we look around the world today, a little bit, closer to a year from the murder of George Floyd, that you know, that was a wake-up call for a lot of people. It was all too familiar for so many more, and brought millions of people around the globe to the street and beyond with, you know, cries to end white supremacy, the systems of racism. A lot of people are still tired, and we're still seeing evidence of racism against Black communities, Asian communities, Muslim communities, Latino communities. And unfortunately, you know, the list goes on. So do you think, are we headed in the right direction?
I think we are, you know, I think the evidence by, when I think about, I'm inspired by the millions that took to the streets. I, you know, am inspired by the conversations, the public conversations, and the way that narrative is changing and public consciousness is changing around the role of racism, white supremacy, kind of these institutions, these systems in our that are in the DNA of our country, and folks' willingness to learn. And so all of that to me shows that we are headed in the right direction. And as an organizer, when I see the levels of civic engagement that have been, you know, when I see voter turnout at the levels that it is, when I see the way people are connecting through circles and other membership organizations, that is a good sign that that we're participating, and that folks are trying to find their way in to this movement, into this moment, and pushing themselves. So all of that to me is about us moving in the right direction. I think where I still want us to go, and where I still want us to go further, particularly as institutions, and I say that running an institution and being in community with other foundations, is that I want them to close the gap between what they're saying, all the messages, the statements that they're putting on their websites, the commercials that they're running, and the pictures. And I want them to close that gap between that and then what they're actually investing in, what they're resourcing, how much money they are literally giving to racial justice. And so there's lots and lots of talk, but then when it actually gets to investing in the type of system change work that is going to lead to transformation, that is going to address the types of ingrained systemic barriers that Lim talked about, and that folks were nodding about, because they know that it is in the way our assessments, our housing appraisals get done, right? Kind of, we have the data there. We have the data and hiring practices. So these opportunities are there. And so that's where we want folks to really lean in and move beyond the rhetoric. And so so yes, I'm inspired. I see us moving in the right direction. But for some folks who are trying to just mosey there, and I know how to mosey, I'm from Texas, you know, but this is not the time for moseying. This is the time for, you know, determined walking, running, if you will, toward freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Rita. And CeCe, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with Retta. You know, I am inspired by what we've seen over the last year. It's been a catalyst, right, for folks to kind of take action and move forward. I also think that the true measure of whether we're moving in the right direction or in having any type of success is really going to be measured by those most impacted, right, by the systems of injustice in all that we serve in this sector. One of the fundamental questions that we ask all the time at the Kellogg Foundation is, are the children well? And that's kind of our measure of, the kind of systems change work that we're supporting through partners. And our founder's vision, for the foundation, when it was set up over 90 years ago, was that children everywhere would face the future more confidently and be more secure in their trust of this country and its institutions that serve them. And while I think the last year has brought us much clarity about what needs to change and extended our visions about what's possible, there is still much more to be done, right? And right now, the practice of philanthropy is under an intense microscope. We're seeing a huge shakeup, and there's a lot of discomfort. And I'm happy with that discomfort, right? I think that discomfort is what pushes us forward, and we need to sit in it. It's a real opportunity again for this moment of clarity and to envision, as Lem and others have said, reimagine what is possible in building a more just practice. And so we're being pushed, and that's inspiring. That's what we need to see happen and to change.
And just to build on that just slightly, because I love the moving beyond the rhetoric, because I couldn't agree more. And that same civic engagement of moving beyond the rhetoric, or the same spirit in which we saw this movement, or the movement continues within protest, within voting, that same type of energy needs to be within the halls of these organizations and companies, right? The sense of agency in which the young generation have is astounding, and I love it. I mean, it gives me life, and I'm like, yes, go, keep doing it. And so, this sense of I actually have more to gain than I have to lose is the exact thing in which will, drive these organizations to make fundamental change that goes beyond, the written talking points and, statement. So could not agree more. And, how now it's like now activating that in a way that creates or makes companies more transparent, make them be more accountable and engaged in the community in a way. So you can start that through financially, but then you're going to have to move beyond that to meaningful policy and using your voice in that way.
This is incredible, and I hope you are all reading the love that you're getting in the chat from people, because yes, you're talking about civic engagement, moving from the words to the action. And I would also add representation, right? Like I am inspired by how, it was overdue. The fact that we need a lot more representation of Black and brown folks everywhere, right? Because people respond to people that look like them. And if we are not part of the decision made, the decisions that are being made about our communities, we cannot move the needle, right? So I so agree with you. Okay, I'm getting super excited. Yes, nothing about us without us. Yes, love this chat. Okay, Ebony and CeCe, what strategies are you most focused on for supporting racial equity now?
I'll let CeCe go first, and then I'll hop in since I just spoke last. Go ahead, CeCe.
Sure, thanks, Ebony. So I feel like there's things that we're continuing to do and things that are emergent, right? That we're hoping to support as well. Racial equity is part of what we call the DNA at the Kellogg Foundation. Beginning in the mid 1960s, we took a race equity approach in supporting HBCUs and furthering educational opportunities. Today, we really stay focused on ways to share power, honor voice, and leadership at all levels, and upend narratives, right? right, that undergird racial hierarchy. We talk often about racial hierarchy and its persistenceness in our everyday narratives, right? And we're, showing up to hold space for, again, grant making in both existing and emergent opportunities, like supporting new networks like Philanthropy Together, right? Also thinking about how we continue to support improving employment equity, building worker power, growing access to quality early childhood education, all of those fundamental priorities that we've had and held for a very long time. It shows up currently in this last year in support of vaccine equity, supporting census and redistricting work, right? And that's work that is really focused on communities, engagement and leadership and setting agendas within that work, right? So understanding how community is showing up in that space. It also shows up again in our practice, right? Continuing to give 3+ year grants, taking out social bonds, right? We took out a social bond along with a few other funders to be able to extend the amount of giving that we're doing, another 300 million over the next 2 years, right? And we also, continue to support funder collaboratives. I know some folks that are joining us today are part of other collaboratives where we're talking about, ways that we can do better together. And also thinking about collective giving. I know Retta has shared much about her own personal experience in being part of a giving circle, and Kellogg Foundation has been supporting 20+ years of philanthropy for and by communities of color through catalyzing community giving and cultures of giving. And so continuing to support that work. We saw over this last year, mutual aid, other ways of collective giving, being nimble to the needs of, very direct community needs in response, right? And how do we continue to support that infrastructure that, mutual aid networks need to be able to continue to do the work that they need to do, things that Lem is holding up at Possibility Labs, right? Things that provide practical resources for folks that are moving work on the ground. And so, so our focus is holding that space to be able to really, find what community needs and to build upon that and support that and be nimble in our own practices to be able to do it and do it in a way that doesn't, again, cause more harm.
Mm-hmm. How beautiful is that? That's amazing. Maybe I should have went first instead of going after CeCe. How we show up for racial equity is showing up humble, number one. And something that Lem said earlier, right? When he talked about, what is the experience of a Black person walking in a bank? Number one, I have to be humble, and I can't be defensive. I have to honor that experience. And honoring that experience means I recognize and I'm empathetic, but how do I change it, right? How do I change the perception of what that looks like, right? Amongst my peers who are here, I'm on the bank side, which, again, we have to be humble about who we are and what we do and our place in society and our role in history. Number one. And so recognizing that is number one, how I show up. And that's the lens in which I bring that work. That's the first thing. The other ways in which it shows up in equity is, okay, so if we know that, what are the historical contexts of how we got here? And so when we deliver this work, when we talk about health, small business, jobs, housing, it's with the lens of the historical context of what do these communities feel? It doesn't mean if it's real. It means what do they feel? And that is hard, and you have to listen. And so number one, we listen to the community, we listen to people, and I listen from a place of this is how you feel. So let me help change that. Let me create systems over time, because it took a while to get here. And so it's going to take a while to unwind that, right? And so it shows up in health equity, right? It shows up in how do we provide no-cost flu vaccines to folks? How do we show up to understand that there is hesitancy, but there and we have to, we can talk about hesitancy, but we also have to trust history. And we have to give people a space in which they are allowed to feel that way and still continue to educate them along the way. It shows up, in the work that we do with historically Black colleges, with community colleges, which are the bedrock of institution, with the bedrock of communities, and spaces and places which provide affordable education for many students of color. And so the investment of that and allowing the community colleges and these schools to be at the center. But the companies need to be at the table. The student need to be at the table at the same time. And how do we all sit at a conversation at the table and understand what are the career pathways that are going to get me out of debt quicker, that's going to get me to wealth, easier, that will then transform my community. So really thinking about the system, to everyone's point, that's in place, and how can we help influence and drive some of that work. It shows up in ways in which we are focused in, I talk a little bit about HBCUs, but like, how do we ensure that the presidents of these institutions who are new, who came in the midst of a pandemic, how do we make them successful? They are incredibly vulnerable. And so we have to wrap our arms around these institutions and these new presidents and say, how do we help ensure that you are around for another 150 years? And not only are you around for another 150 years, but you thrive and you take your place at the top, at the head of the pack, right? And so it is, and then we have to show up in an authentic way, because then the first question is why is Bank of America doing this, right? And so again, we have to sit back and we have to listen and we have to be humble and we have to understand that our communities in which we live and work, we are proximate to those issues. We have people in places in every single one of those communities. And when they walk through the halls of that door every day, they don't leave their community at home, they bring them with them. And so we have to honor that by saying, what are the issues? What are the pressing issues within your community? And so let's do this top national approach, but what's going to work in Charlotte? What's going to work in Austin, right? Like what's going to work in DC may not be the case for LA. And so that proximity to the issues is another way in which we show up. But number one is listening and being humble and understanding our place in history, honoring it, but also moving forward.
Thank you, Ebony. Thank you. I know we're running out of time, which is awful because I had 5 more questions and it's just, but I want to ask real quickly to Lem and to Retta, where do you find inspiration or, the staying power for this work? Where do you find that inspiration? And then to all of you, quick round of what is one piece of advice that you have for everyone in the audience or for how to meaningfully contribute to the massive systems change of anti-racism and racial equity? What can people do, tomorrow? But first, Retta, where do you find inspiration or the staying power for this work?
Yeah, absolutely, hands down, from the movement leaders on the ground, and the wins that we're having every day. The wins that we're having in individual communities, at a local level, at a state level, and federally, and so those are the pieces that we have to lift up and continue to lift up, because I think it nourishes us and gives us the fuel to move forward. And very, very locally, I am inspired by the Black middle and high school students who are leading DC's local police-free schools campaign. These young people are brilliant, they are visionary, and they are clear that they have a leading role to play in creating and imagining a world that none of us have seen yet. And so the things that they're asking for, they know that we don't know how to do them all because we haven't imagined it, we haven't seen it, but they are pushing and they are clear about that. And the best part about it, you know, again, based why I love being here in this conversation, I know about this group. The group I'm referring to are young people who are members of the Black Swan Academy. I know about this group because I learned about them through my giving circle. They were a giving circle grantee. I fell in love with them when I was I volunteered to do their site visit. And then a couple years later, joined the board, you know, got to know more of the young people, the work, and kind of their tremendous organizing and the policy wins that they're having in DC and with the DC public school system, and just love it, right? But it also was just this arc of what it means and like what happens when you get connected in this way. And just really quickly, I'll say that that is connected to my advice for folks on what they can do, because the thing is, particularly in these conversations, it can feel massive, it can feel overwhelming, it can feel too large for little old us to make a difference. And I mean, and when I think about Black Swan, when I think about Black benefactors and my giving circle members, my piece of advice for folks is join an organization, right? Because it is in community that change can happen. An organization beyond your place of employment, right? And so an organization that is committed to doing racial justice work, to system change, and that is an organization, because it's in relationship that you'll have people to hold you accountable to the self-interrogation that has to happen, right? So that we can also examine in ourselves where we're reproducing some of the very same systems and cycles of oppression that we're trying to eradicate. And so it's about being in relationship, being an organization. An elder told me that probably when I was 18 or something, and I have never forgotten it, and it is so true for me. It's how I stay sharp.
Thank you, Rita. I read that, and I love it because it's the going beyond the dollars, right? It's what we learn in giving circle. It's not only about the donation. How do you go beyond the dollar and joining an organization, joining the board, being part of something gives you so much more and so much learning, and opens your mind to so many different things. Lem, I'm going to pass it to you. And I think we're going to be running over, dear audience. No one wants to leave, so we'll run over 5 more minutes. Go ahead, Lem.
Yeah, so I would echo a lot of what Rita was saying, which is the thing that keeps me inspired is community. Seeing what movements are doing right now, both the policy and systems change wins and cultural wins that we're seeing, and the shifts, but also the bold strides that folks are making in taking ownership and governance of their communities. Building, there's this group of folks in East Oakland and all over the country, but I'm just more in tune with the Bay Area, but building, restorative justice systems, like a whole reimagining the entire justice system and building anew. And it's happening in small ways in some ways, but when you connect it together and you see it as a bigger picture, it's people are transforming the world, and doing it based on our own experiences of the world as people of color. We're not waiting on, no one's waiting on philanthropy to do it for us. We're doing it. And so I think the call to go to the piece about advice, the call to philanthropy is listen and pay attention to what's happening. I think, there've been, and I've seen that happening so much, the folks on this panel, I've been in a lot of conversations where people are just like, yeah, we want to resource that thing that you're already doing. But I think that framework of communities know what they need, and in positions of power, we really have to listen and resource follow that leadership. So that's what I would say.
Thank you, Lem. Thank you. Ebony, your advice for the audience.
I mean, you're doing it. I mean, I don't have any, that's the beauty of this audience, they're doing the work, right? And so I would say continue to do the work and recruit, right? How do that's the, the ability to bring in new folks, new individuals. I love the way Retta talked about her father being a philanthropist before she understood what that meant. And I know there's a lot of people who are philanthropists and don't quite understand what that means right now. So educate them, make them aware, bring them into these circles so they can continue to do the work. We're missing a lot of powerful voices here that need to be brought in.
Thank you. Thank you. CeCe.
Yeah, so
bring us home.
I'm just so inspired by what everybody else already shared, and I'm going to connect to something that Retta mentioned about finding places of accountability. I'm a huge fan of Adrienne Marie Brown, and shout out to Mario Lugay, if he's on this phone call listening, who has recently reminded me about the importance of having political homes and being engaged in that capacity. And that, the whole context of about a political home is about finding partners and people that you can be accountable to, right? That help deepen your why, deepen your relationships, and that you can find alignment to. And so that's my piece of advice is like, find your people, find those folks, right, that you can be in those accountable relationships with. Also, I would say, just be really clear about your distractions too, right? I think the other part of this is like understanding sometimes what our distractions are to progress. And sometimes those are personal and sometimes they're institutional or organizational, right? So taking time to figure out what you need to unlearn or what you have distractions to your progress to be able to mitigate those. So yes.
Thank you, CeCe. And yes, Mario, I think Mario is on the call and we all love Mario. And I love Mario because if he doesn't agree with something that you're saying, he's not shy. He's going to say, like, check yourself on that. So shout out to Mario. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time. I'm telling you this, I hope this is the beginning of another conversation that we can do. Let's get it scheduled in a few months and we can invite everyone back again. I would love to thank each of you for this very important discussion. Thank you, Ebony, Retta, Lem, CeCe. We really, really appreciate the valuable insights, your stories, and how can we do something tangible right now, tomorrow, right? So before we wrap up, I just want to remind people to complete your post-session evaluation. We want to know, that I saw that you love the panel, so let us know on the evaluation so we can have more content like this in other events. In the next few days, we are going to have this recording ready so you can tell your friends that were not able to join us, just to come in and hear it. And another announcement that we wanted to give is Philanthropy Together. We will be relaunching our racial equity community of practice this fall. Last year, we partnered with the Community Investment Network with Community Build Ventures to host a 6-month community of practice where dozens of Giving Circle leaders came together to learn and to discuss how to embed racial equity into their Giving Circles culture, grantmaking, and community impact. And this fall, we'll be relaunching the Racial Equity Community of Practice as an ongoing active learning for Giving Circle leaders. So it won't be 6 months, it will be, ongoing, because this is a journey and we can all keep learning. So please join us, everyone. If you're interested in learning more, there's a link in the chat. And thank you again for joining us. We will be transitioning to speed networking happy hour, so everybody now can bring their drinks. I know some people have been drinking since the session with LCF about culture and love and vino in Giving Circles. So it'd be great to see many folks there. And thank you, Ebony, CeCe, Lem, Reta, for joining us today. We are going to be sharing a link in the chat to Twine, which is the platform to do the networking. Open it up using a Google Chrome, because otherwise it doesn't work very well. So see you there. Thank you, everyone.